So as white settlers have moved westward, Native persons have found themselves pushed onto reservations. Now, this is not unique to the 19th century, not unique to the 1800s. It goes back to the 1600s, if not even further to the 1400s with the Spanish settlers to the United States. Now, the reservation systems were a way to make sure Native persons were in a limited space and a way to make sure that they could be quote unquote controlled. Like the American government has always seen it as a form of control. But they were also supposed to be a place where you could have sovereign lands. So sovereign land means that the native population gets to have their own laws, gets to have their own customs, and gets to do so without federal intervention. So for example, on sovereign lands, it is native law that is supposed to be the most important law, not federal law. In sovereign land, it means that if somebody comes onto your land and murders someone else, it's the native population, the native police, who are in charge of leading the investigation, not outside police, so state police or federal police. So sovereign land suggests a level of autonomy and suggests a level of political self-sufficiency. Sovereign lands, the reservations, were also supposed to allow Native persons to continue their way of lives. So for example, most Native populations have lived communal lives, where instead of having this idea of private property, so this is my house, or this is my land, my 1 acre of land, or how big it is, or these are my clothes. They've had ideas of, okay, well, we share this together, and everyone pitches in and everyone gets something out of it. And that was supposed to be part of the reservation system and the sovereign land system. But that's not what actually happened. Instead, most of the reservations were overseen by federal agents. They still are often called Indian agents, who were men and women actually, who made sure that the Native persons obeyed federal law, and they even would determine who leaders were. So for example, technically, if you're on a reservation, the tribal nation can determine its own leadership. And usually this is done by a democratic process. But in multiple cases, we'll see the federal agents step in and say, well, no, I'm appointing so-and-so to be your leader. And that's an ongoing theme with the reservation systems. Now, federal law has really tried to limit the importance of the reservation systems. For example, the Dawes Act of 1887 said that any Native person who left the reservation system would be given 160 acres of land, so the same amount of land that you got if you followed the Homestead Act. Moreover, it suggested that you might be able to gain citizenship. So Native persons, Native men, were not allowed to vote at this point. So if you know anything about the end of the Civil War, at the end of the Civil War, Black men were given the right to vote. And technically, the Constitution stated at that point that regardless of race, you were allowed the right to vote. But that's actually not what happened. Native men were still just excluded from this. So the Dawes Act starts to suggest that, well, if you leave the reservations, you might be allowed the right to vote. Some Native persons did follow the Dawes Act, but most will remain on the reservations because that's where their families are and that's where their homelands are. Okay, so now we're coming to my fun stuff. I'm so excited. Okay, so this is actually what my research is in, so I'm just ridiculously geeky excited about this part of class. So we talked about westward expansion and how we see the tribes being pushed on to the reservations. Well, as the government is doing that, they're also saying this isn't a good idea. They don't like the fact that the tribal nations are keeping their own traditions, their own values, and they want the tribal nations to adopt white values. So by white values, we mean clothing, we mean food, which often means steak and potatoes or something like that, meat and potatoes. We also mean language. So the government says we don't want you to speak your native tongue, and that wasn't meant to be a pun. We want you to speak English. So this is what's called assimilation. This idea that you are going to become like us. That's the idea. That's the value. We want you to become like us. So the government goes on a variety of assimilation attempts. Some of them are more direct than others. So for example, the Dawes Act that I talked about was an assimilation attempt. It said that if you accepted these values, you could, if you accepted these values, so if you lived on your own land, you could gain citizenship. That's assimilation. But a more overt means of assimilation comes from education. The government started to have schools that were run and funded by the government for Native students. Now, some of these schools were on the reservations themselves, some of them were boarding schools. Now, the schools had been funded on and off from the 1820s. We see a massive push in these schools at the end of the 1860s with Grant's peace policy, which said that the schools should be run by the churches, by various religious communities. Of all the churches, it's the Catholics, and Catholics are Christians, who run the most schools across the country. And they are given money. They're given money to run these schools. Now later, by 1900, the federal government will say, well, no, we don't want the churches to run the schools. We want the students to go to public school. But for the time period we're really looking at, it is going to be religious organizations who will run assimilation attempts. And one of the main reasons for this is there's a belief that religious persons are not corrupt, and B, a belief that in order to truly be white, in order to embrace white values, not only do you have to speak English, for example, not only do you have to dress like a white person does, you also have to be Christian. It didn't matter which denomination, which group of Christianity you were a part of, but you had to be Christian. And so this was part of the assimilation attempts of the period. My research and my forthcoming book is actually on the Catholics who ran these schools. So the most famous of these schools was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School was run by a man named Richard Henry Pratt, who was a former military officer, and he had worked with various groups, particularly the Seminoles in Florida. And he had started assimilation attempts with prisoners of war. So these are people who had been captured in battles, who were being held in army barracks. And he starts to teach them English, he starts to convert them. And he says, you know what, this is a brilliant idea. I need to get government involved with this. And so he requests money to form a school for children in order to assimilate them into white society. His goal, he says, is to quote unquote kill the Indian, save the man. He wants to get rid of all native culture and to replace it with white culture. And he sees white culture as true mankind. So he founds the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was seen as kind of like the flagship school for assimilation. It was completely federally funded, and unlike other schools, it was not run by religious groups, though the students were required to go to church. They could just go to church at any church they wanted to, so long as they went to church. I've actually published 3 articles on Carlisle, so I can answer all these tons of questions on religion there. So the school was in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. It's literally 45 minutes from where I grew up, which is how I know about it. The school was full of students from all over the country. There were students from as far away as Alaska who attended this school. What Richard Henry Pratt did at first was he would travel around the country on the trains, and he would go to the various Native leaders and say, hey, if you send me your children, you will get more funds from the government, or you will get more goods, such as food, from the government. And the tribal nations were always starving, so the local leaders would go, okay, sure. So Pratt initially kind of just traveled around picking up students and then would head back to Carlisle. Upon entering Carlisle, the students were immediately taken and they were forcefully washed. Their clothes were then taken and burnt. So many of these clothes were kind of their best dress. They'd worn them and they were considered to be like their finest clothes. They're wearing them as a sign of pride, and they're being taken and burned. Their hair was then cut off, and these students actually end up freaking out because in many tribal nations, in many communities, if your hair is cut off, it means someone died. And so these students are like, oh my gosh, did my family die? What is happening here? I'm so scared. And the faculty said, oh, well, we're just making sure that, their hair isn't dirty or if there's no lice, etc. But these students were freaking out. They're then told they could not speak their own tongue. They could only speak English. And they're then given a new name. And they're forced to dress in clothes that reflect white values, white American Eurasian values. They're then told, okay, you can only eat these certain types of food. And the students actually got really, really sick from this because a lot of the food by this point was very, very processed, and they're used to eating very raw food, and they're just getting sick all the time. So some students ran away from Carlisle, and they were often captured because they may come from a reservation in South Dakota or Oklahoma, and they have no clue where they are. They're in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, which was kind of the point of the school. Others died. We don't know how many died there, but many died of tuberculosis, which is a respiratory illness. The goal for those who survived was to go home and then teach their friends and family how to be white. What are white values? Now, some of this was language, some of it was how to dress, some of it was just job training. At the Carlisle School, students were given an industrial education. So they were taught how to work in the factories, for example. They were taught how to be printers, so they could run newspapers. They were taught how to be farmers, how to be woodcutters. And the idea was that they could take these ideas and take them home and then assimilate is a better term, the rest of the community. Now, the Carlisle School was very proud of what it called its success rate and very proud of the work it did. And in its, I call it its propaganda in anything it published, talking about how great the assimilation process was and how successful it was. One of the images they used over and over was that of this young man whose name was Tom Torlino. And this image was just reproduced over and over. Now, I've actually gone into Tom Torlino's student file, and there's nothing on it. But I can tell you, because I was looking at other records, he was Catholic, because I went and found his name at records at a Catholic church in Carlisle. So I want you to look at this image and think about what has changed from the left side, which is when he entered the school, to 3 years later when he left. And how does it reflect the values of assimilation and of Carlisle? I have another example of the assimilation. I want you to examine these two images of some students who were Pueblo. And again, send me your thoughts on the before and after photos.